Okay, you know that feeling, right? You're just, I don't know, grabbing a coffee, maybe picking up some takeout,
Yeah.
or even buying like beer at a bottle shop, something totally random, and then bam,
The
the
screen.
screen flashes up
Oh.
18%, 20%, 25%. I've even seen 30%.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that sort of awkward pause,
Mm-hmm.
that internal debate like, okay, do I tip here? Should I? How much?
It's become so common now across Canada, hasn't it? That slightly jarring moment.
Yeah.
And the collection of sources you shared, they really get into this feeling. They point out how this confusion, this pressure, it isn't just you. It's like a big signal that tipping culture is changing.
Changing really fast.
Really fast.
It really feels like a huge shift in how we deal with so many businesses day to day.
Definitely.
So we've taken the stack of material you sent over articles, some research, expert opinions, and we're using it for this deep dive.
Right. And our goal here is basically to unpack what's going on with tipping, why it seems to be changing now, and importantly, what does it all mean?
For everyone involved.
Exactly. For the customers facing that screen, for the workers who often depend on those tips, and, well, for the businesses trying to figure it all out.
Okay, let's dive in then. What does the material show us first?
Well, right off the bat, it says this tip nudge, as one source calls it.
Tip nudge.
It's basically a well-established societal norm now in Canada, and a huge part of that, those payment machines, the card readers,
They're everywhere.
they make it so easy for almost any business to just add that tip prompt onto pretty much any sale.
And that leads to this thing the researchers call tip creep.
Tip creep, yeah. It's basically tipping showing up in way more places than it used to.
Like where?
Well, the material mentions the obvious ones, coffee shops, takeout counters, but also retail stores sometimes,
Right.
even gas stations apparently. And one source even mentioned a laundromat, which seems unexpected.
Wow, a laundromat. Okay, so feels like anywhere there's a payment, there could be a prompt.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's not just where, it's also how much they're suggesting. That's the other piece.
Yeah.
Tipflation.
Tipflation, okay.
So not only is the prompt appearing more, but the suggested percentages are climbing.
Right. I remember when 15% was kind of standard, maybe less.
Exactly. One analysis tracked that shift. Pre-pandemic, maybe 10–18% was common. Now, those prompts often start at 18%, go up to 25%, sometimes even 30%.
So it's hitting us from both sides.
That's what one expert called it, a double whammy for consumers.
Oh, so
Well, businesses are asking for tips more often, and they're raising their prices because, inflation, their own costs are up.
right. So you pay more for the thing itself, and then you're asked to tip a higher percentage on top of that higher price.
Exactly. It adds up quickly.
Which brings us straight to how customers are feeling about all this. And the numbers in the sources are pretty stark.
Yeah, one survey found 94% of Canadians feel tipping has gotten out of hand.
94%?
Yeah.
That's huge.
It's massive. And digging deeper, 90% think the suggested amounts are too high, and 82% agree it's just expected in too many places now.
There's a real disconnect, isn't there, between what the screen suggests and what people feel is actually, right for the situation.
Totally. One report pointed out that the average person might think, say, 9% is reasonable for some things.
Okay.
But the machine is starting the options at 18% or more.
And that gap, that creates this pressure or guilt.
A lot of guilt, apparently. The research showed 70% of Canadians have felt guilty leaving a store or cafe because they didn't tip enough or maybe didn't tip at all.
70%? Wow. And that could happen even if it's just a quick purchase,
That's
right?
right.
Or when the prompt comes up before you've even gotten the service.
Yeah, exactly. Which really shows the power of what's called choice architecture.
Choice architecture. Explain that.
It's basically how the options are presented influences your decision. Those preset percentages on the screen, they act as anchors. Yeah, they frame what seems normal or appropriate. When the lowest option is already high, it makes tipping that much seem like the baseline, the expected thing.
It sort of nudges you upwards, makes not tipping or tipping less feel wrong somehow.
Precisely. It subtly shifts your perception of what the right amount is.
And there are stories about this, right? Like the one about the baker.
Oh yeah, the anecdote about a local bake shop. They put up signs saying, look, tipping isn't expected here.
Okay, so they were clear.
Very clear. But customers still apparently question the prompt on the terminal, especially if they were just buying, like, a loaf of bread.
So the screen's suggestion almost overrode the store's own message.
It seems like it, for some people anyway. That little digital prompt carried a lot of weight.
Okay, so that's the customer side. The confusion, the guilt, the pressure. But we absolutely have to look at it from the worker's perspective, too.
Critically important, yeah. The sources are really clear. Many workers in customer service rely heavily on tips.
Why? Because base wages are low.
Often, yes, their hourly pay can be low, sometimes historically even lower than the standard minimum wage in certain places. Like Quebec used to have a lower minimum wage just for servers.
Right, I remember that.
And while that's changed in some provinces, the material mentioned, there are still discussions, sometimes from industry groups, about maybe reintroducing a lower wage category for tip staff in places like Ontario.
Really? What's the argument there?
The argument presented is that it helps businesses manage labor costs, assuming tips will make up the difference for the worker. But it's definitely a contentious issue with very different views on how wages should work.
It sounds like it. And the material argues this reliance on tips
Yeah.
makes the whole system kind of unfair.
Yeah, inequitable is the word used. It can create really big pay differences.
How so?
Well, between front of house staff, like servers who get tips directly, and back of house staff cooks, dishwashers who might get a smaller cut from a tip pool or sometimes nothing. And even among servers, your income can swing wildly. A busy Friday night versus a dead Tuesday lunch. Totally different earnings, which makes budgeting really hard. It's not stable.
So the argument is the customer is basically subsidizing wages the employer should be paying.
That's a core argument presented, yes. That serving other customer-facing jobs, they're skilled work. They deserve a fair, predictable salary from the employer, not reliant on how generous customers feel that day.
At the same time, taking tips away right now without changing anything else?
Would be devastating for many. The sources absolutely stress this. For a lot of workers currently in the system, those tips are essential. They make a huge difference in being able to, make ends meet.
It's a real bind. Okay, so given these tensions, customer pressure, worker reliance, arguments about fairness, are there other ways? Are businesses trying anything different?
Yes, definitely. The sources highlight some examples, particularly restaurants trying a no-tipping model. Places in Toronto like Richmond Station, Barks Smarthouse, Beast Pizza were mentioned.
No tipping. How does that work in practice?
And the main way described is they raise their menu prices across the board.
Okay, so the cost is built in.
Exactly. They calculate what they need to pay all their staff kitchen, included a higher, stable wage, often aiming for a living wage, and build that cost into the price you see on the menu. No tip line on the bill.
And what are the results? What do the sources say about how that's going?
Well, the reported benefits are pretty interesting. For staff, the big one is stable, predictable income. One worker was quoted saying, "It helps him actually make my rent."
That's huge.
It is. And it creates fairness between front and back of house. Everyone shares in the success more evenly.
And for customers?
The term used was palpable relief. Just not having to do the tip calculation, not feeling that pressure at the end of the meal.
That sounds appealing. But it can't be easy to switch to that model.
No, the sources definitely acknowledge the challenges. It's tough to implement. You have to really communicate well with staff who might be giving up the chance of really high tips on great nights.
Right, they lose that potential upside.
They do, even if they gain stability and avoid the really bad nights. And for the business, raising prices is always a risk. Will customers accept it?
Is there an appetite for it, though? Do customers say they'd prefer it?
Apparently, yes. One survey mentioned showed 59% of Canadians said they'd actually prefer the no tipping model, even knowing prices would be higher.
Almost 60%. That's interesting. So people might be willing to pay a bit more upfront for the transparency and less pressure.
It seems that way, yeah. Willing to trade the awkwardness for clarity.
Okay, so that's individual businesses trying things. What about, like, bigger changes? Government intervention, is that discussed?
It is. Quebec's Bill 72 came up. It specifically mandates that any suggested tips on payment terminals have to be calculated on the pre-tax amount.
Ah, not the total, including tax.
Right. And the reactions to that, mentioned in the material, were pretty mixed.
So,
Some servers felt it was good, maybe encouraging people to tip a bit more if the base number was lower. But some managers and other servers were worried it would just mean less money overall for staff who rely on that income.
so it highlights that tension again with what's better for the customer's final bill versus the worker's take-home pay.
Exactly. And it feeds into that bigger debate about the minimum wage itself.
Right. You mentioned different viewpoints on that.
Yeah, some stakeholders pushing hard for a much higher universal minimum wage. The idea being floated was well above $20 an hour, so tips wouldn't be necessary for a living wage.
Making tips truly optional, a bonus.
That's the idea. But then conversely, you have some industry voices, as mentioned before, suggesting maybe going back to lower minimums for tipped workers specifically. So very different philosophies on how to structure pay. The material just presents these different arguments impartially.
And any other ideas floating around, like market changes?
One expert speculated that maybe the market itself will force changes. Perhaps restaurants offering different service levels, like a section with full traditional service and tipping versus maybe a section using more tech, like tablets for ordering with different pricing and expectations.
Interesting. Using technology to maybe reduce reliance on the traditional tipped server role in some cases?
Potentially, yeah. It's one possible direction things could go.
Man, it's complicated. So many layers. Like taxes, too. Tips are taxable, right?
Absolutely. The sources remind us tips count as taxable income in Canada. Whether your employer pays them out or you get them directly in cash, you're supposed to track and report them.
Okay. And what about where the tip actually goes? Does it always go to the server?
Not necessarily. That's another murky area the material touches on tip distribution. Sometimes there's a house cut where the establishment keeps a percentage.
Is that legal?
It's actually illegal in some provinces. Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick were mentioned, but it's more of a gray area elsewhere.
Hmm.
And there was that one story, remember, about the pizza place.
Oh, yeah, the takeout counter where the tips reportedly went back to the owners.
Exactly, not the staff. Which makes that advice to just ask where your tip is going seem pretty reasonable if you're feeling unsure, especially in a takeout or counter service situation.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what about outside Canada? How does this compare internationally?
That context is really useful. The sources point out that in places like the UK, Australia, lots of Europe, parts of Asia, tipping just isn't the norm like it is here.
Why not? Higher wages generally.
That seems to be a big factor, yes. Service wages tend to be higher, so there isn't the same expectation or need for customers to supplement income through tips.
Makes sense.
There was a perspective shared from someone who moved here from the UK. They found Canadian tipping culture really confusing, especially for things like, say, getting a haircut.
Right. It extends beyond restaurants.
And they contrasted it with working as a server in Australia, where they felt much less pressure because the base wage was significantly higher.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, we've got the customer feeling pressured and confused by tip creep and tipflation.
Right. Then there's the worker, often relying on those tips in a system that can be unstable and inequitable.
We have businesses experimenting with different models like no tipping, facing their own risks and challenges.
And experts analyzing trends, governments perhaps intervening with regulations like pre-tax calculations, and this ongoing debate about minimum wages.
It really feels like we're at a tipping point. Pun intended, I guess.
Yeah. The sources are pretty clear, though, that there's no clear fix that makes everyone happy right now.
It feels deeply rooted, this system.
Deeply entrenched was one phrase used. It feels like we're kind of stuck with it in some ways because it's so ingrained, but at the same time, it's obviously shifting really quickly.
And it's tough for everyone involved.
Mm-hmm.
Customers are facing higher costs of living, and often the person serving them is in the exact same boat financially.
Exactly. So that practical advice the sources offered for customers, it's really about taking back a bit of control.
Like setting budgets.
Yeah, maybe having a monthly tipping budget. Or deciding to prioritize tipping more generously at places you really value, like small local businesses. Or just consciously building it into your plan when you go out.
And the point was, doing that isn't being cheap or stingy.
Not at all. It's just being practical and intentional in a landscape that's genuinely changing and, frankly, getting more expensive. Wanting to manage your money thoughtfully in this situation is described as completely normal.
It definitely leaves you thinking. We've looked at how it's expanding, the pressure points, the worker reality, the alternatives being tried, the bigger debates.
It's a fascinating moment for sure in terms of consumer culture and labor issues in Canada.
So the final question for you, listening, next time that screen prompts you, what goes through your head? Given all this, the push for clarity, the need for stable wages, the whole debate over who should pay, how do you think you'll navigate it?
And maybe how has diving into all these different angles changed how you view that simple, quick interaction?
Definitely something to mull over next time you're faced with that 18, 20, or 25%.